welcome, everybody. So I hope many of you must have seen Peter Levine from this morning from 8 to 9. Quite amazing, right? Super incredible. And that is a beautiful entry into the conversation of today. Do you want to introduce our guest of the day?
Yes, and this morning we are delighted to have with us Gabor Mate. Welcome, Gabor. I'm just going to do a quick introduction. Gabor Mate is a renowned speaker, physician, and an author, best known for his expertise in addiction, stress, childhood trauma, and mind-body connection related both to illness and well-being. His work reframes the way we view human development and trauma, and he has developed also an approach called compassionate inquiry that is a wonderful approach to work with trauma.
And on that note, we're gonna organize this July 16th to July 19th, an online event in limited number. Is a retreat, really. It's a retreat. Required your presence every day with Gabor and Betsy Polatin that will appear today at 12 o'clock doing some exercise. Just keep that in mind. The title will be deep work, not a conversation. Return to ourself, the wisdom of trauma is the title. July 16 to 19. We just announced it yesterday. Yes.
Yeah. And thank you, Gabor, for being with us today. We know you're at the finishing line of your book, of delivering your next book, The Myth of the Normal, Illness and Health in Insane Culture. So I know your time is precious, so we really appreciate for you being here.
Thanks for having me. Peter Levine is a tough act to follow. So.
I'm sure you can do it.
You know how to follow any act.
I yet to find an act you couldn't follow. But let's see if today. I just want to add one more thing, another little gem that we are making together, an incredible feature-length documentary which will come out in the next, I would say, 3 months, hopefully. The Wisdom of Trauma with Gabor.
Which we are re-editing.
We are the last final. We are re-editing the final. It's going to be a feature-length documentary, and it's going to be another amazing huge project. We've been working for 3 years together.
And I just want to say, while we were filming Gabor in Vancouver, we were walking with him on the streets of downtown Vancouver, and it was an incredible experience to see the gratitude of the people on the streets. People recognize Gabor, they run after him, they say, "You saved my life." It was incredible that the impact Gabor has had on that community. And you've worked there, 10 years ago? Or
I retired from medical work 2011, so 9 years ago. I worked there for 12 years altogether.
Yeah, and still Gabor is like a
legend and literally
a
people running to him on the street. "You saved my life, you saved my life." It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's such an honor to be able to get close to you with this movie and to work with you and to have you with us, Gabor. Really. Thank you. Thank you.
So one thing, Gabor, we have been exploring this week in this retreat is in the spiritual traditions, crisis often is seen as an opportunity to see more of ourselves and more of reality. What are some of your reflections on what is this crisis providing us? Why is this crisis unique? I mean, humanity has gone through many crises through the centuries and eons, but what's unique about this one? And also maybe what is revealing about what's insane about our culture?
That's simple, right? Okay. Well, what's unique about it is that it's so global. I mean, there have been world wars, but most countries in the world were not involved, or most places in the world were not involved in those world wars. They happened. Second World War happened in Asia, and Europe. But this is a complete world. It's not a single continent. Maybe Antarctica, that isn't involved in the COVID issue. Number one. Number two, the technological unity, the connection that the internet has created makes it impossible for anybody not to be aware of what's happening in all of the world. So there is a sense in which this is more global than I think anything we've ever faced before. Number one. In terms of opportunities, well, I think we'll have to see retrospectively. I think it's a bit early to draw conclusions at this point. I think there's a lot of legitimate debate that will happen later on about, was this handled the right way? Did we do the right things? Were we aware of the impact of our decisions? But those decisions are those answers will have to wait in future retrospection. What is more interesting to me is, what does it reveal about our society and about our culture that truth has always been here, but we haven't actually looked at? And this crisis is more or less rubbing our face in it. Can we get away with ignoring certain truths that we've been ignoring until now? And what are those truths that are being revealed? So, for example, we were talking before the podcast began about how in the US, 25 million people have lost their health insurance because they lost their jobs. Well, that's barbaric, and that's the only way to put it. That just when, in the world's richest country, just when people most need it, they lose their coverage because they lose their jobs. They lose their jobs because of a health issue, and as a result of that health issue, they lose their health coverage. I mean, what does that tell you about this particular society? I'm talking about American society especially, because the same barbarism doesn't exist in the rest of the Western world. But certain facts do exist throughout the Western world. So the US and the UK, for example, it is minority populations that are disproportionately succumb to the effects of the virus. Well, why is that? Well, that's because these people happen to be the most stressed, owing to economic and racial and social stratification and oppression. What does that say us about health? What does that tell us about health? It tells us about health is that health is not an individual matter. Health is a social matter. And that's not just true now, it's always been true. If you look at the statistics for African Americans in terms of dying of cancer or succumbing to high blood pressure or diabetes or heart disease, those figures have always been disproportionate. Well, we haven't paid much attention to that, have we? All of a sudden, it's front page news. Are we going to learn the lessons? The same thing in the United Kingdom. In the UK, the first 10 doctors to die of COVID were physicians in the BAME category, Black, Asian, minority ethnic. Is that pure happenstance? Or is it a matter of social reality that people who are marginalized are more stressed and therefore more likely to succumb to illness? So there's a lot of these social questions that are rising to the fore now, that the reality of which has always been with us, but we've ignored. Well, let me run something else past you. What if I told you that there was a preventable disease that kills something like 80,000 Americans every year, and 8 million people around the world? Maybe it's 200,000 Americans. I forget the exact statistics. Every year, and 8 million people around the world, a preventable disease. Would you join in generating resources and public attention and concern and public health activity?
Yeah, of course.
There's such a disease. It's called there is such a problem. It's called air pollution. Air pollution kills 8 million people every year. Where's all the public attention? Where's all the concern? Where's the resources and the sheer alarm directed at it that the COVID crisis has created? And yet it's far more dangerous annually than COVID ever, in its worst case scenario, threatens to be. So what I'm saying is that there's certain realities about the world, the globalized culture, that lead to some inescapable questions. And so the interesting issue for me is, will we have learned anything? Now, one more point, and then I'll stop. Isn't this showing us? I mean, everybody talks about how we're all in this together. Yeah, that's true, but we're not on this together in the same way, as I just pointed out. But the unity of everything, how when something happens somewhere in the world, that affects us all. And how really we can't separate ourselves from nature. A lot of articles about how our encroachments on nature have a lot to do with the arising of these dangerous viruses. Well, that sense of unity, has it not always been true? Does it take this to teach it to us? And the question is, are we going to remember it when this is over? So again, to sum up, for me, the interesting questions are, what is being revealed about our present-day reality that we've been ignoring so studiously until this moment?
Yeah. And there is something here that it's actually, this crisis is also asking us to really, it's not about our beliefs, what this virus is, or what we should do or not do. We're really connected, and whether I wear a mask or how I move or what I do, I have to consider others. So we're kind of really forced to be in this together.
Well, that's the point I'm making, is that when has that unity not been true?
Exactly.
It's not more true now than it ever was. It's just more dramatically apparent now. So, you know, the question for me is, are we going to learn these lessons? Are we going to remember them, or are we going to go back to what we like to call normal?
Right, yeah. So, yeah, and the other thing is we had the climate crisis that has been also showing the same thing for years and is getting more and more intense. And that didn't wake up humanity to do anything to reduce the emissions, to change our lifestyles, and again, is there anything that has to do with our fear of death, that we are all immediately kind of confronted to face that through this pandemic? Do you think that has to do with the way we're being mobilized?
Well, I think the fear of death is an interesting one, because all of a sudden, I mean, we're all going to die. We all know we're all going to die. But usually we can distance ourselves from that knowledge. And particularly in North America, we live in a fairly death-aversive culture.
Denial of that. Yeah. One of our previous speakers, Reverend Deborah Johnson, she said, everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die.
Yeah, that's right. And all of a sudden, we're told that if we don't do this, we're going to die. And if you don't do that, you're going to die. And then if you don't stay 2 meters away from people in the street, you might die, or they might die. So the fear of death certainly is a powerful sergeant major that gets us to step into line and to march in step. But then we ignore it. You know, like the climate crisis. Well, that's not going to affect me immediately. It might affect my grandchildren, maybe. But let's just forget about it. So it's a denial of reality that we live in most of the time, including the denial of the reality of how we create conditions in which death becomes more of a threat to some people than to others. And now, what's unique about this one is that it's a threat to all of us. But will that teach us anything? And I'm not that optimistic. I think I don't know what to say about that. I really am agnostic on the questions of what we're going to learn here, because there have been terrible tragedies before. I mean, did the world wars teach us anything? Well, wars have continued. You know, how many times have we been on the brink of nuclear war after the devastation of the Second World War? The genocide, did that teach us anything? Well, did it? Because there's been genocidal activities ever since throughout the world, as we all know. So I'm not confident. And it's not because people aren't capable of learning.
Yeah, but if also, we don't learn from pain, then what we learn from? How do we learn? You're right. Humanity hasn't learned from some of the cruelty we have inflicted on each other over centuries.
And yet it's better than it was. So, I mean, there is a little, Gabor, we know the fact that you are the master of pessimism in many ways. That I love what you said. You said, every morning I count my curses. And I will say, well, I count my blessed. So I just want to put that in perspective. And I agree with you 100% that we have definitely not learned the lesson fully at all. But, you know, you slap somebody on the face once, twice, three times. Hopefully this time will be a little better. I just have to add this.
You think it is better? I mean, I suppose we could have a geopolitical debate about how better things are.
Yeah, but let's not go there. I just.
Well, let's hear.
Yeah, let's hear it. Yeah.
Well, look, I don't want to take this too political, but what if I told you? Like, most Americans don't know this. Well, what if I told you that in the 1990s, 100,000 Guatemalan Aboriginal people were killed by an army trained by the US? And it's true. 100,000. You never even hear about it. It doesn't exist on your radar screen. People who are expert commentators who promoted the Iraq War, in which at least 500,000 people died, are still expert commentators, listened to with respect on American TV stations, and they're considered to be knowledgeable, worthwhile people to listen to. What have we learned? You know?
The millions of people in refugee camps that live in unhuman conditions. I mean, that's at the moment as we speak.
I'm not buying into the idea that things are a whole lot better. And this is where the issue is not just one of individual, individuals can learn. That's true. And there's been beautiful personal transformations. You know, there have been people who are capable of learning. As a physician, I know this. People have cancer, and you think they'd see cancer as a terrible tragedy, but they end up expressing gratitude for what they've learned. People go through terrible addictions that nearly killed them, and then, and you know, have devastated their lives and the lives of their families. And in the end, they come through it, and they say, "Thank you for that experience, because I've learned so much." So I think that possibility exists now. I don't want to dismiss that possibility. Mm-hmm. But I'm somewhat agnostic as to whether on a social level, not on just an individual level, but on a social level, that learning is going to take place. Mm-hmm. I think on the individual level, there's going to be a lot of people who have learned a lot. And maybe that's where our focus needs to be, is what can we as individuals learn? And the reason I'm less optimistic on a social level is that society isn't just a question of random individuals. There's institutions, there are forces of power, there's elites, there are strata that have a lot at stake in the status quo. They're not going to be that eager to see that status quo changed. And those are very powerful forces. So they're not going to be eager that the lesson should be learned. So I think there's that tension between what we can learn individually, and that's, I think, a lot, and then there's what is going to be learned socially, which I think is an economic, political, cultural question that goes beyond individuals.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and now I want to bring the conversation around trauma, which is really where you have a lot to teach us and to share. So for many of us, for many people, all trauma has been reactivated with this situation of pandemic. There is so much unknown, so much misinformation, losing jobs. Many people are stuck at home struggling with whatever their situation is at home. What do you have to say? Is it an assumption that we are all living in a highly activated field? And how do we recognize early signs of trauma activation, let's say, in our lives?
Yeah. Well, one of the great teachings of Peter Levine is that trauma is a disconnection from the self and from other people and so on. So, trauma is not terrible things happening. That's not trauma. COVID is not trauma. How should I say this? A child being abused is not trauma. Sexual assault in itself is not trauma. Trauma comes from the Greek word for wound. So trauma is a wound. So something can happen and not wound you, or something can happen and wound you. So the question is, are we being wounded? So a child who's mistreated, but who is not alone with it, who's got somebody who's capable of holding them emotionally and hearing their fear and hearing their grief and hearing their anger and validating their pain, that child will not be traumatized the same degree, or no, maybe not at all, as a child who has to endure all that by themselves. So the trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. And so ostensibly, the same thing can happen from the external point of view to two people. One will be traumatized, the other will be not, depending on how resourced they are, either internally or externally, to deal with the impact of those external events. So will COVID be traumatizing? It will depend very much on how we handle it and how isolated we are with it, or how much support we get, or what inner resources we have already developed in life to respond to an external crisis. So then the question becomes, and I'm sure you've been addressing this over the days, is, well, what are those internal resources that we can rely on or call into play or strengthen, fortify, that'll help us not be traumatized by this event?
And what can it be the impact that this social isolation can
we can expect
what
to
can
see
we expect
in the
to
future
see
in society?
Yeah, in the society, what can be the impact of this?
We're already seeing it. I mean, there have been reports internationally of elevated levels of domestic violence, for example, of overdoses. In Vancouver, there's been more overdoses now, but we've seen this elevated drug use elsewhere as well. So one thing we can see is that when people are stressed, and when their usual modalities of diverting that stress are taken away from them, that stress is going to show up in dysfunctional behavior. And I keep hearing about corona divorces, marriages that have sustained certain stresses, fault lines over the years, but now there's no getting away from them. You can't go to the pub to have a beer with your friends. You can't go to the job. You can't even go to the community center to get on the exercise machines. And you're stuck at home with this person who is, in the name of a famous book, your intimate enemy, you know, and all of a sudden the tensions arise. So I've heard a number of such cases. So we're already seeing that. Now, on the other hand, again, you know, I mean, you mentioned the world crisis in the beginning, and we all know the famous, I hope this is true because it's so beautiful, but the famous Chinese enneagram for crisis is danger and opportunity. It's a mixture of two symbols, for danger and opportunity. So if that isn't true, it should be true because it's so beautiful. And it's also an opportunity, right? So, for example, people are staying at home with their kids all of a sudden. Well, I've had some parents say, boy, what an opportunity. I've just finally realized what I've been missing. Contact with my kids, playing with them, singing with them, dancing with them, eating with them. It's really has strengthened our relationship and has brought us closer. So that's an opportunity, is to discover what our busy, fervent, or frenetic, I should say, normal ways of life deprive of us in terms of opportunity just to be, to reflect, to
what's essential,
to exist together, you know. So that possibility exists. On the other hand, of course, there are people who are not paired, who are not coupled, who don't live in family structures, so they're all totally on their own. So for them, there's also an opportunity to, but when there's, and of course, there's lots of opportunities for diversion. I mean, the internet gives you endless possibilities for distracting yourself.
the news.
Yeah, well, but and that's the other thing. But let's ask ourselves, when you ask yourself, how many hours a day do you spend reading about or watching news about the COVID situation? And then ask yourself a second question. How many hours do you really need to spend to get the information that you need, practically speaking? Well, the answer to the second question is 5 minutes. In 5 minutes a day, you can find out all you need to know. The rest of it is pure distraction from your own self. So here's an opportunity to actually be with yourself and to find out what you're running away from so much. And maybe there's somebody that you get to appreciate and like if you hang out with yourself long enough. But it is, so for everybody, there's an opportunity here. The question is, are we able to seize that opportunity?
So one of the things, so trauma really lives in our nervous system, in our bodies. These are patterns that our nervous system has learned as a response to what happened to us. How do we, and someone else said earlier in the week, like we cannot heal that which we don't feel. So all our distractions is a way not to feel these uncomfortable states and patterns. So how do we begin to feel and build intimacy with some of those old patterns that we carry in our bodies? And
well, those patterns show up. I mean, I speaking for myself, I may be one of the people in the world least inconvenienced by this whole thing, because it so happens, as you mentioned, I'm working on my next book, and my schedule was strictly to stay home these 6 months and not go anywhere and not give any speaking engagements, just to be home and write. Well, guess what? So I'm staying home and writing. The only inconvenience for me is that I can't go to the swimming pool. Really. But that's okay, because I can bicycle and I have my own machinery at home. So what I'm saying is that here's a person who is financially not threatened, whose way of life has not been significantly impacted. And yet I still notice in myself a kind of heaviness at times. Yeah. And I've even noticed in myself at times a kind of panic. Well, I know enough to realize that those feelings have nothing to do with the present moment. Because there's a difference between genuine concern. Yeah, I should be concerned about the COVID situation. We should all be concerned about it. But a sense of panic, nothing's threatening me. I'm not going to get sick as long as I follow the rules. And maybe I won't even get sick even if I don't follow the rules. So panic has got nothing to do with the present situation. So that made me realize that this is old stuff. So whenever the internal emotional atmosphere is out of sync with the actual level of threat, we know that it's old stuff. So you know what? Now some of that for me has to do with the challenge of writing this book of mine right now, which has really been hard going. But listen, here I am, age 76, and for the first time for a long time, I'm talking to a therapist once a week now. And I haven't done that for a long time. I'm the guy that you're supposed to come to get help. I'm not the guy who's supposed to go to help somebody else, you know? But this has brought up enough to say, okay, you know what? This is not the present moment. This is old stuff coming up. I need help to explore this. I need help to hold this and to resolve it. And so it's that incongruence between the present stimulus and what we're experiencing internally that tells us that this is a trauma impact.
Well, I'm so grateful for you sharing this, because that kind of level of humility we barely ever hear from spiritual teachers. And many of us have the projection that they have finally achieved that state. There is never, and there is a lot of, it can generate a lot of self-judgment, like, oh, I'm reacting. So yes, I just feel like you're giving us permission to be more human, and that's the only way we can actually heal, by feeling all this.
Well, you know, I tell you something. So I do speak internationally a lot, and I come into contact with many people who, appropriately enough, have earned the right to be considered sources of wisdom, or at least conduits of wisdom. Who knows what the source is? But I'll tell you, they're just as human as the rest of us. You know, we all have our stuff. And that's why sometimes I find it a little bit humorous. Like, even looking forward to this conversation today, I thought, well, why are they calling me? Like, you know, you think, you know, that this, believe me, I go through my life not feeling this, like this fount of wisdom or source of truth, you know. That's not my experience of myself. And I don't know about other people who are similarly called upon, but I know we all have our stuff. That's just how it is. And it doesn't matter how eloquently and articulately and how accurately and appropriately we speak about these matters and teach others. There's always stuff that we have to learn ourselves. And as a matter of fact, I mean, this is a whole other conversation, but there are so many examples, and you know, you and I have had this conversation before. There are so many examples in the spiritual world of, and more are coming to light all the time, of people who have bestowed or taught great wisdom, who've had terrible contradictions in their personal lives, to the point of
hurting others.
Yeah.
Really hurting others, yeah, because they haven't dealt with that dark side of themselves. They haven't acknowledged it.
That's why we keep inviting you, because you're a true teller.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're
And
so
we don't need
honest.
more idols and more, unattainable
Models of
or states. We need humility and honesty. That's
yeah.
Some of our teachers actually speak about that. This is really not about awakening. It's about deep honesty.
I'm not sure humility is the right word. Honesty, maybe. Humility, I don't feel so humble, I'm,
Only an humble person can say that they don't feel humble. Because if you're said to be humble, then you will not be humble.
I can be very arrogant, believe me. In fact, I used to say nobody's accused me of not being arrogant. Okay, so anyway, never mind about. All I'm saying is we all have our contradictions, and that under a situation of stress such as we're all going through, those contradictions are going to come up.
Exactly.
So it is an opportunity to really see what is it that I haven't looked at here. What is it that's coming up now? That's always been there, but I've allowed myself to ignore it. And as I said earlier, that question comes up both for us as individuals, and it comes up for us as a society as well.
So, I mean, the healing trauma has become almost trendy. But what do we really mean by healing trauma? How does trauma really healed, or we become more intimate with our trauma? How do we understand healing trauma?
Well, I was having a brief conversation maybe a month and a half ago with a woman who lives in California. Some of you will know her name. Her name is Edith Eger, Eger. And Edith is a survivor of Auschwitz. She's 92 years old now. And she lived in the same city in southern Slovakia from which my grandparents were taken to Auschwitz and killed. And she herself was either on the same train or within a couple of days of the same shipments that took the Jews of that city to Auschwitz. She survived. And she became a therapist. She was a dancer, and then she became a therapist. She's still seeing clients at age 92. And she's written a book called The Secret, which is an international bestseller. And we're both Hungarian speaking. It's a Hungarian speaking part of Slovakia. And we have people in common. So we talked briefly, and I hope to speak to her again soon. And I said to her, I still haven't worked it all out. I said, I'm 76. No, she's 92. And she said, don't think you'll ever work it out. Don't even think about that. So this question of healing trauma, as long as we don't, it has to do with seeing more and more and having more and more agency. Like once you see something, you can have agency over it. As long as you don't see it, there's no agency. So for me, healing trauma is not about ever becoming perfect and having fully worked it out. It's really about daily learning more and more if you can. And to the extent of learning, then applying that into your life. So that's what to me healing is about. It's a process rather than an event. It's an ongoing work rather than a destination. And so very often people say to me, I've been working on this for 20 years and I'm still, yeah. Would you rather not know what you know now that you didn't know 20 years ago? So don't think of healing as a destination. And, and healing is not about despair never arising and panic never arising and hatred never arising and rage never arising and sadness or gloominess never arising. It's a matter of how you relate to it when it does arise. Do you think you say about that?
Yeah, I do. Hi, Ray.
Hi, Ray.
Hi, Ray. Good to see you. What?
Did you all watch The Wire?
Mm.
Anyone watch The Wire?
That TV
That
series.
TV series?
Mm.
There was a famous character in there who'd say "true dat," meaning true. True dat.
That's right.
I would say true dat.
And I just wanted to say this, Gabor. We interviewed also Almas for this series, and he also has the same perspective on what we call realization or awakening. He calls it runaway realization, meaning you never really arrive anywhere. It continuously keeps unfolding and revealing more and more, but you can never arrive, really. So
it's a journey. It's an endless journey, and you're always there at the end of the day.
Yeah. Although I do think that Almas is speaking about a spiritual reality that I haven't really entered, as far as I can tell. He might tell me differently. I mean, he's one of my great teachers.
No, it's true.
But he's been to places. I think he's been to places that, as far as I'm concerned, I haven't been. And but so I'm more in the emotional, psychological realm, which he well understands. But he's also dwells on a spiritual path that I can read about and appreciate, but I don't know that I personally ever approached it, or it's entirely possible that I just have too much ego in the way to even recognize it if I saw it. I don't know what the truth of that is, but I do think there's layers to this, different layers.
And yeah, Almas is really a master in describing those experiences that he has from different dimensions of being, or whatever we want to call it. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Thank you for clarifying that. I was wondering if you have something to say, and then maybe we open for questions about resilience and surrender. Like, how do you view resilience these days? Everyone is talking about building resilience. And how is that related to surrender? Like really surrendering to what is? Do they have something in common, or?
Well, I'm sure they do, but surrender is not. I should probably put a sign on my door saying, "I don't do surrender."
You don't.
I don't got a clue about surrender. I mean, Ray could tell you about it, but I can't. I was speaking to a very famous actress yesterday, Ashley Judd. I was interviewing her for my book, and Ashley's very open about talking about her trauma and her multi-generational family trauma. But she also describes a beautiful experience of surrender. And I asked her what that was like. I said, "Well, can you put it into some words?" And she said, "Well, it's peace, it's emptiness." She surrendered to a God she didn't even believe in.
Wow.
And peace and completion. And it's aloneness, but it's an aloneness that's got nothing to do with loneliness. It's an okayness. It's that there's nothing more needed. And I understood her words. I just haven't had that experience. And it really was a moment of suffering in which she surrendered. And it's not that I haven't suffered, but maybe I haven't suffered enough or intensely enough, or I don't know, or maybe surrender is just something that from my particular personality type is something in the way. But I also know that when that surrender happens, it does promote resilience, because as Ashley told me, you never forget it. It doesn't that it always stay. It doesn't mean that it always stays with you. And maybe Almas could tell you this as well. It's not necessarily that it always stays with you, but it's a point of reference that you never forget. So for me, surrender is more of a, okay, this is how it is. I got to accept it, but there's no big spiritual realization with it. Now, Ray's had experience of surrender. Maybe she could tell you about it. She wants to.
Great.
I find at moments of the greatest pain, that's when I really have had breakthroughs around what it is to surrender. I'll just give two examples. One at a time when I felt like my life was ending and coming apart just because of stuff.
Stuff.
I know that stuff.
That stuff.
We had that stuff too.
In fact, we had separated, and I was on my own, and my heart was broken. And I got so much wisdom and solace from being in nature. I was walking in a beautiful place where there's a lot of wild grass on the bluffs, and the wind just bends that grass so that when the wind blows, it bows. It just, the grass bows. And I just prayed to be able to bow in the wind, like the grass, and I'd watch it spring back again. And it was so effortless for it. It just, that's what it does. And that's what trees do in strong storms. And the ones that don't, of course, it's a cliche, but it's so true. The ones that don't break, but if you have heavy branches and you bend, you come back again. The other was when I was in labor with my daughter, Hannah. I was still at home laboring, and the contractions were so strong. I had this image of being a little house on a prairie, and a tornado or a huge wind is coming. And if I don't surrender, if I close up or get tightened, I'll just get smashed. But if I open the front door and the back door, i.e. the mouth and the perineum or whatever, the wind will just blow right through the house. It'll come in the front door and out the back door, and the house will be fine afterward. So that was another kind of surrender. Just like, okay, I open, you go right through me, and I'm in.
Oh, thank you, Ray. That's beautiful.
Just really sustain me. It's like somebody just said,
Gabor. My name is Gabor.
But I think you might have said it as that once these things happen, you don't forget them.
Yes.
Like they sustain you. So when I'm now, against it, I will reference those times.
Beautiful.
Thank you. And Gabor, I'm sure you have experienced surrender with ayahuasca. There is no way you can be working with the medicine and not knowing surrender. So I'm sure that.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Really, once. Much of the time, I don't want to talk too much about that experience of mine, but I lead people, and I've led retreats, and I can really help people go through those experiences and open themselves to it. But my own mind has been very much in the way of my own experiences. And literally but that's true. Last June, I had this deep experience in the jungle in Peru of surrender. And it was really quite amazing. It's true. Thank you for the reminder. My mind tends to forget that,
And I have...
Right. The mind forgets that. It's not of the realm of the mind.
Yeah.
And Gabor, I've seen surrender. I mean, I can tell you, Gabor does know surrender, and he has surrendered, but he forgets it because his mind is very, very convinced that he doesn't do surrender. That he fails at surrender, and that other people get surrender.
So surrender is not what happened to you, it's how you perceive surrender.
I think so.
Into the trauma, yeah.
Thank you, Gabor, and thank you, Ray, for joining us. It was delightful to see you and to have your contribution.